The Tree's Wife by Mary Elizabeth Counselman, published in 1951 in Weird Tales. Not only gods, but lesser spirits haunted the forests. Sometimes they are portrayed as nymphs who occasionally marry mortals, only to die when their tree form is cut down. Sometimes the wood spirit in particular is vindictive. To strike at it invites an attack of sudden weakness. To some who approach it with an axe, it brings instant death. These old legends come from very ancient agricultural customs, when man and the plant and the animal life around him were mutually interdependent. Today, when the despoilers of our land are cutting down our forests and ruining our environment, a story such as The Tree's Wife seems particularly pertinent in its portrayal of a primitive belief reawakened in modern times. I smiled at my companion, Hetty Morrison, county welfare investigator for the Bald Mountain District, when I dropped into her office that morning, mostly to dig up nostalgic old memories of our college days at the University of Virginia. I found her arguing over the telephone with a local mechanic. "But I have to make a field trip this morning. Why can't you get the parts? Take them out of somebody else's car. Oh, the devil with what you think would be right. There's a family that might be starving." Hetty had hung up, still sputtering. A gaunt, severe-looking old maid with a heart as big as the Blue Ridge Mountains. She glanced up then, to see me grinning at her, jingling the car keys of my new club coupe. By way of an invitation. We were such close friends. No words were needed. Hetty merely jerked a nod, slammed on her hat, and started out the door, with me in tow. "You're gonna be sorry," she warned me. "The road I have to take is an old Indian trail, and if they had to get back and forth on that, it's no wonder they're called the Vanishing Americans. You're gonna total your suspension." I looked so dismayed, pausing to unlock my first new car in 10 years, that she closed one eye in a craft look I knew so well from days at college when she was about to ask the loan of some money. "It's a dull trip. It's just routine field work. Of course you wouldn't be interested," she drawled casually. "Not in Florella Dabney, the girl who married a tree? We pass right by the Dabney place. No, dear, you're liable to scratch up that nice blue paint. Oh, in Holy Creek, it would cross the road 4 times, and we'd have to drive through it, hub deep. Oh, I always get stuck, and I'd have to." I scowled at my old friend, very familiar with all her clever tricks of getting her way, but still unable to cope with them. "A tree?" I demanded. "Did you say married a—" "That's right," Hetty nodded with a smug grin. "It's a very strange case, almost a legend up around the Bald Mountain, although," she added, blatantly climbing into my car, "well, it's not without precedence. In the old Greek legends, Zeus was forever turning some girl into a sprig or a flower or some inanimate object so his wife Hera wouldn't find out about his escapades. Even as late as the 15th century, there were proxy weddings where some queen or other married her knight's sword because, well, he was off at war. And then there's an African tribe I heard about where the men are married at puberty to some tree." I grimaced impatiently, climbed into the coupe, and started it with a jerk. Hetty had aroused my interest, and, well, I think she knew it. She would get her ride over the wild, brushy crest of Bald Mountain, or I would never find out about the girl who married a tree. An hour later, bouncing over a rocky trail pressed closely on both sides by scrub pine and mountain laurel, she began to tell me about Florella Dabney, and the bloody feud that, a trained psychiatrist might explain, had left her a mental case with a very strange delusion. The Dabneys, Hetty related, they'd built a cabin and begun to wrest a living out of the side of Bald Mountain about the same time as Daniel Boone. 6 generations of underfed, overworked mountaineers had lived therein, planting a little, hunting a little, and raising a batch of children as wild as the foxes that made inroads on their chicken supply. Now Florella was the youngest daughter, a shy, willowy child of 15, with flowing dark hair and big, luminous dark eyes, like a fawn. Barefoot, clad in the simple gingham shift that all mountain girls wore, she could be seen running down the steep side of Old Baldy as nimble as a city child might run along a sidewalk. Her older brothers and sisters had all married and moved away, and her mother died, and Florella lived now with her father on their sparse farm. Now, on the other side of the mountains, well, there lived another such family of old settlers, the Jenningses, and as far back as anyone could remember, there had been bad blood between the two, starting with a free-for-all over a load of cordwood that had sent 2 Dabneys to the hospital and 3 Jenningses to jail. Now, both attended the little mountain church perched on the ridge that divided their farms, but no Jennings ever spoke to a Dabney, even at the all-day singings, when everyone was pleasantly full of food and home brew, and no Dabney would sit left of the aisle, and any baptizing that had to be done in Holy Creek after a rousing revival meeting, well, it needed to be arranged with the Jenningses and the Dabneys immersed on alternate days. Now, Reverend Posey Atkins, the lay preacher, he recognized this as a regrettable but inevitable condition, and that was just the law on Bald Mountain, up until the spring evening when, well, Joed Jennings and Florella Dabney had run off together. When and how they had ever seen enough of each other to fall in love, neither family could imagine. Joed was a stocky blonde boy who could play a guitar and shoot the eye out of a possum at 50 yards, but not much else. And what astonished everyone was Florella's regard for such a Doolittle, since she was halfway promised to a boy from Owl's Hollow. Now, it was assumed, when a party of hunters saw them streaking through the woods one night, that Florella had been carried off by force, much against her will. She had gone out after one of the hogs which had strayed. Now at midnight, when she had not returned, her pa, Hank Dabney, went out in search for her, and he ran into the hunting party and promptly stalked back to his cabin for his rifle. He was starting out again, with murder in his close-set, mean little eyes, when a pair of frightened young people suddenly walked through the sagging front gate. With them was Preacher Adkins, dressed, well, either for burying or for marrying, with the good book clutched in his hand that trembled. But he spoke steadily. "Hey, Hank, these 2 young'uns has sinned, but the Lord's likely done forgave 'em already, and now, well, they aim to marry, so you can't stop it, and don't try." Without preamble, he motioned for Florella and Joed to stand under the big white oak that grew in the front yard, towering over the rough cabin and silhouetted darkly against the moonlit sky. Now, high up on the trunk, if Hank had noticed, was cut a heart with the initials J.E.J. and F.D. Solemnly, the old preacher began to intone the marriage ceremony, while Florella's pa stood there staring at them, his lean face growing darker by the moment. Hardly had the immortal words, "Do you take this man?" been spoken, when he whipped the rifle to his shoulder and he fired at Joed point blank. The boy was dead as he crumpled up at his bride's small bare feet. "I'll learn you to go sparking out some girl behind my back," Hank roared. "Oh, you trifling no-account." He never finished. For a second shot rang out in the quiet night. Hank Dabney pitched forward on his face, crawled across the body of his prospective son-in-law, and fired twice towards the powder flash in the woods beyond the cabin. Hell broke loose. It seems that Reverend Atkins had expected such a blow-up, and someone had carried the news to Joe Ed's pa, Clem Jennings, and he had hastened to the spot to stop the wedding. Now, the old preacher, fearing this, had notified the law. The sheriff, with a hastily gathered posse, had shown up at the moment when Hank and Clem fired at each other over the body of young Joe Ed and the prostrate, sobbing form of his near bride. In a matter of minutes, the posse had both fathers in handcuffs and hauled off to jail. But behind them, they left a tragic tableau. Little Florella weeping over the body of her lost lover, and old Reverend Atkins standing dumbly in the background. Two of the posse had stayed behind to help with Joe Ed's body, which the weeping girl had begged the preacher to bury. And then and there, under our tree, it was there, Joe Ed had caught his first kiss with her, holding his hand over her mouth and laughing, with Hank not 10 yards away. It was there in the night that she had first told him she loved him, and promised to slip away with him into the deep silent woods of Old Baldy for a lover's tryst forbidden by both their families. It was there, months later, terrified and ashamed, that she had sobbed out to him that she was with a child. She knew there was nothing left but to kill herself. Her lover was a Jennings, and she had expected no more from him than a few moments of wild ecstasy. But Joe Ed had surprised her. Fiercely protective and loyal, he had announced that the following night he would stand with her under the tree in the Dabney's yard, and he'd have Preacher Adkins marry them right in front of the old Hank. His child must bear his name, the boy said proudly and tenderly, and he hoped it would be a fawn-eyed little girl exactly like Florella. All this old Preacher Adkins related to the two members of the posse, while they took turns digging a grave for Joe Ed Jennings at the foot of the big white oak, under which he was to have been married. Florella stood numbly by, watching, no longer crying, like a trapped animal at last resigned to its bitter fate. But, regarding her, the old lay preacher suddenly remembered a story from his childhood days. A myth, a legend? Walking over to the girl, he took her hand quietly, and he led her over to the tree, where the two pitying neighbors were just patting the last spadeful of dirt over Joe Ed's crude grave. "Florella," the old preacher said, I heard tell of some queens in the old days, marrying a sword that belonged to some feller that'd been killed in battle. You know, now that Joe Ed has passed, I'm most assured that he'd want you to go ahead and take his name. So, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna make out like this here tree is Joe Ed, being that he's now buried neath it. And I want you two men, he faced the gravedigger solemnly, I want you to witness this here marrying of Joe Ed Jennings and Florella Dabney. And he raised his eyes humbly. Lord, if what I'm about to do is wrong, please just punish me. But Lord, if this is right, please bless this here ceremony. And there, in the moonlight, the old preacher proceeded with that strange proxy wedding of a girl to a tree, and the two members of that posse stood by, wide-eyed and amazed. And as they heard Reverend Atkins repeat the familiar words of the marriage ceremony, and they heard Florella's sobbing replies, and then heard, well, was it only the wind in the great tree towering above them? Or was it? Both men later had sworn that what they heard sounded like a whispering voice, like a man's voice, like Joe Ed's voice, coming from the depths of those thick green branches. But as Hetty remarked dryly, it had been a hysterical night, and hysteria, well, it can play tricks on the human senses. Well, is that all? That's not all, I demanded as the car launched madly into Holly's Creek, a third crossing, and plunged wetly out again. What happened to the girl? With her father in prison, who's looking after her while... Well, was the child all right? Slow down! You're liable to get us killed, Hetty snapped at me pleasantly, clinging to the car door on her side. Yes, of course the child's all right. A little girl? Why, I had welfare send a doctor out here when I got the message that Florella was in labor. She's been living on in her father's cabin, quite alone, for the simple reason that her relatives and all of Joe Ed's were simply afraid to come to the place. I frowned, puzzled. Why? Why? Because of the tree, Hetty said blandly. Why, word got around that it's haunted. That Joe Ed's gone into the old oak and, well, that it was alive. Sentient, that is. That it didn't behave like a tree no more. I must say. Hey, look out for that rock, you goose! You want to wreck this thing? I must say, some of the things that happened out here were odd, to say the least. I slowed down obediently, picking my way over the rocky road. Anything to keep Hetty on the story that had so captured my imagination. Well, what things? I demanded. Anybody could hear voices in the wind, leaves rustling, branches rubbing together, but, Hetty drawled, just anybody can't see a tree catch a live rabbit, or a dove that's perched in its branches. No, just anybody can't. What? I gaped at her. I never heard of anything so ridiculous. My attempted laughter sounded flat, however, even to my own ears. How on earth could... Don't ask me, Hetty said cheerfully. All I know is that the lower branches of that big white oak kept Florella supplied with meat. Rabbits, doves, once a possum. Why, they even got choked, some way. Had got their necks caught in the twigs. She'd find them there, all ready to be cooked and eaten, the way any good mountaineer might trap to feed his family. Well, so she got to believing that he caught them, that Joe Ed, well, he had quite a reputation as a hunter-trapper. Good Lord. I tried to laugh again. You are not hinting. Ah, that poor kid. I broke off pityingly. But an experience like that would naturally affect her mind. Living there all alone, too, with a baby. Then, Hetty went on pleasantly, well, then there was the fall day. Real cold. When a neighbor woman dropped in, nosy old sister just wanted to say something spiteful to Florella about the baby. When she was leaving, though, well, Hetty chuckled, it seems her coat got all tangled up in a tree branch that dipped down over the gate, yanked right off her back, the way she told it. She lit right out of there screaming bloody murder and told everybody that Joe had took her coat for Florella. When the girl tried to return it to her, she would not touch it. She said it just wasn't her best coat anyhow. and she wasn't going to argue with a tree. Oh no, I shook my head, laughing, but still trying to ignore the small shiver that kept running down my spine. These mountain people are awfully superstitious, aren't they? Naturally, it was just the woman's fear that made her think. Well, maybe, Hetty said dryly. But it wasn't fear that snatched my new hat off last spring, when I happened to walk under that tree, checking up on Florella. She's a hardship case, of course, yes, sir, she said in a queer tone. Oh, big limb swooped down and snatched that bonnet right off my head. I couldn't reach it, and Florella couldn't climb up to get it. Too soon after the baby's arrival, poor girl was still kind of weak, but the way she giggled and started talking to that tree like it was a person, honestly, it made my flesh crawl. She was so matter-of-fact about it. Joette, you rascal, she would say. Give Miss Hetty back her bonnet now. I don't need no fancy clothes. Me and my baby's doing just fine. Hetty peered at me sheepishly. Why, the way she said it made me feel like a selfish old turkey gobbler. Besides, a hat like that was too pretty for an old hatchet-face like me. But it did give me a turn, I have to admit, when... She gulped slightly. When I told Florella that she could have that hat, why, it immediately fell out of the tree and plopped right a smack on that girl's head, I must say, she added crossly. It was very becoming. Probably the first one she ever owned, poor little thing. Hank was so stingy, old coot. Florella's mother never had a rag she didn't weave herself. I turned the steering wheel sharply to avoid a raccoon ambling across the trail, and then I peered at Hetty. Well, go on, I said grimly. Tell me how the tree sheds its wood in stacks now, so Florella wouldn't have to chop any. Hetty chuckled. Oh no. Mountain men take it for granted that their wives must work like mules. All they do is feed them, shelter them, protect them, with an occasional little pretty thing thrown in when they feel in a generous mood. And that is what Florella expected from her tree husband. And that is what Florella got. Though I suppose a psychologist would say her delusion gave her a sense of security that merely made her able to fend for herself. Lots of people need a crutch for their self-confidence, if it's only a lucky coin they carry around. Coincidence and superstition? Well, my friend smiled, I am obliged to you for the lift. We had a message that Kirby Marsh, a farmer who lives near the Dabby place, got in a fight with somebody and crawled home pretty banged up. His wife is bedridden, so they'll need help if he is seriously injured. You were a lifesaver to bring me up here. This is the turn. She broke off abruptly, grinning at me with a sly twinkle in her eyes. The Dabney farm is just around this here bend. I slowed down, feeling again that cold shiver running down my spine as we rounded the curve. An old cabin of square-hewn logs perched on the mountainside a few yards above the road, with the usual well in the yard and the usual small truck garden in the back. A huge white oak towered over the gate of a sagging rail fence. Its sturdy trunk leaned a bit towards the house in a curiously protective manner, shading the worn front stoop with its thick, dark green foliage. I braked the car outside the gate and Hetty grinned at my expression. Well, there it is, she announced dryly. There's where the girl lives who married a tree. Hey, and that there is the tree. That's him. I got out of the coupe and I walked warily to the gate. Hetty climbed out stiffly and called, in her pleasantly harsh voice, Hello, hello the house, in a traditional mountain style. There was no answer, but all at once I saw a blanket spread under the oak that Hetty had indicated as Josie. A fair-haired baby girl was sprawled on the folded quilt, gurgling and cooing. She looked to be about 2 years old, with the sturdy good health of most mountain children, despite their skimpy diet and constant exposure to the elements. I stood watching her for a moment, charmed by the picture she made, and then I frowned. "You know, she's too young to be left alone," I muttered. "Where's her mother?" "Oh, out picking blackberries is my guess," Hetty shrugged. "Josie's all right, though. Her father's minding her," she added with another impish grin at my expression. "Hello," she called out again. "Florella!" At that moment, a lovely slender girl came running around the house, her feet bare, her dark hair flying, and there was a sprig of laurel over her ear, and blackberry stains on her brown fingers. I stared at her, thinking how like a dryad she looked, wild, free, and happily unafraid. "Oh, howdy, Miss Hetty," she greeted my friend warmly. "Come in and set for a while. Oh, who's that with you, kinfolk?" Hetty introduced me as a school chum, with no mention of the fact that I wrote stories of the supernatural for my bread and butter. We entered the gate and Hetty stooped over to pat the baby, proffering a peppermint from the endless supply she always seemed to carry around. I fidgeted beside her, at a loss for conversation with this pretty, normal-looking young mother, who, from all Hetty had told me, was as crazy as a coot. Once, nervously, I started as a limb from the great tree under which we stood seemed to brush my shoulder, plucking at my scarf. On impulse, I took it off, and I gave it to the girl, who beamed and thanked me shyly, and then she tied it proudly around her own neck. I caught Hetty's eye at that moment, and I flushed as she grinned, winked, and glanced up at the great tree. Then she turned to Florella, lovelier than ever now in the blue chiffon scarf I gave her, and with no more madness in her face than in mine. "I got word that Kirby Marsh was hurt in a fight," my friend said conversationally. "Anybody over here looking after his wife and kids? I heard the doctor came and took Kirby to the hospital with concussion and a sprained shoulder. Must have been some fight to have." Hetty broke off, noticing the girl's sudden expression of regret beyond the politeness expected of a neighbor. Florella ducked her head suddenly, with a rueful little smile. "Yes, ma'am," she said simply. He come over here to this place here last night, and, well, he went to pestering me. Oh, not that Kirby ain't a real nice fella," she apologized for her neighbor gently. "Exceptin' when he's liquored up. I told him to leave, go over me," she added with wifely dignity. "I told him that Joe Ed would not like it, but he would not listen. So I run out to Joe Ed. Oh, it was a storming awful, and he been a-banging on the roof to warn Kirby, but he likely thought it was only the wind." I gulped, racked with pity, and I threw a glance at my friend. "Well then," Hetty prompted softly, in an odd tone, You ran out into the yard, and Kirby ran after you, and then Joe Ed, he whacked him over the head," the girl finished, half apologetic, half proud, well, as any woman might speak of a husband who had stoutly defended her honor. "He'd likely busted Kirby's skull wide open, but Kirby had not to have tried to kiss me," she defended primely. "Ought he, Miss Hetty? And me being a married woman with a young'un?" "No, dear," Hetty answered, in the gentlest voice that I'd ever heard her use. No, Joe Ed did the right thing. I don't think Kirby was badly injured, but somebody's got to look after his folks now while he's in the hospital. Did you go over and see his wife today?" "Why, yes, ma'am," the girl said quietly. but they wouldn't let me in. I reckon on account that they was scared. I mean, of Joe Ed. But he wouldn't hurt nobody else less than he was bothering me or the baby. He's real good-hearted. Yes, of course, my friend said softly. I understand. Well, don't you worry about it, dear. Next time old Kirby's here, you will know better. I rather imagine, she chuckled, that this will be something that keeps him sober for some time. The girl nodded shyly and then bent to pick up the child, but small Josie toddled away from her and ran around the great tree to where a low limb dipped nearly to the ground. "Pa!" she chirped suddenly, holding up her chubby arms to the giant oak. Fing the baby, Pa!" Florella laughed, shaking her head mildly and calling, No, now, Joe Ed, you're liable to drop that young'un, don't you? But as I stared, that low limb dipped down under unseen pressure, and the child Josie seized it, and as I gasped at the spectacle, it was tossed 10 feet off the ground, as if a gust of wind had blown that branch skyward. It had scooped up the baby, swinging her high above us, and then as gently it let her down again, while the young mother shook her head again in laughing reproof. My scalp crawled at her matter-of-fact, unself-conscious manner. Oh, Joe Ed's always doing that. She pleasantly pointed. She loves that. Why, Miss Hetty, she broke off, pouting as I subtly pointed back toward the gate. Oh, don't go. I thought you would all stay for dinner. Joe Ed caught me a rabbit, and I was just fixing to fry it real nice and brown. Can't you stay? But I was out the gate, and I was climbing into my car by that time, shaking my head covertly and beckoning for Hetty to come away. For some reason which I will always firmly deny, my teeth were clattering like castanets, and I kept glancing up nervously at that tall, spreading oak tree, brooding over the little mountain cabin and the woman and the child who lived there, alone. Alone? Pitiful case, isn't it? Hetty murmured cheerfully as she climbed into the car and waved goodbye to Florella. Or Mrs. Joe Edwards Jennings, as she was listed in the welfare files. I mean, my friend expanded. The way the poor girl lives with her baby, from hand to mouth and the prey of, well, men like Kirby. She'd be so lonely and frightened if it wasn't for that pathetic delusion of hers. And she's got that child believing it now. I guess you noticed her swinging on that tree. She called it Pa. Stout branch, though, to pick up a child that heavy, wasn't it? She drawled carelessly. The wind blew it, I guess. Like the other night when it whacked Kirby Marsh over the head. Awfully windy up here on Old Baldy. She peeked at me slyly, her lips twitching. I glared at her, and I stepped on the gas, aware of the cold perspiration that had sprung out on my forehead, because it was not windy, it was close, and very still, and beside me, Hetty was chuckling softly as I glanced back at the barren little farm, except for one low limb of that giant oak tree, again tossing that happy child playfully into the air, while its mother looked on, lifting it gently, like a man's strong protective arms. Not a leaf was stirring as far as we could see over the rugged mountainside. Not a leaf. The Tree's Wife by Mary Elizabeth Counselman. Performed by Mark Wilhelm. Thank you for tuning in again. This has been your scary moment.